I'm very pleased to introduce Misha Glenny. I'm sure everyone in this room knows who he is. He's been writing for all sorts of... this dates me, but I remember when he was covering the Balkans for The Guardian, which is a very long time ago. Misha Glenny also writes for The New Yorker, The New York Times, The New York Review of Books. He's been not only well known as a sort of expert in Russia and the Balkans, but he's written published two books recently, which I thought would make him a really interesting speaker for this conference. One was McMafia, which was about the rise of organized crime, and Misha Glenny talks a lot about the relationship of organized crime and transition economies. And then Dark Market, which was a sort of compelling and riveting, but also thorough, exhaustive, sort of definitive book on the hacking community and sort of cyber criminals around the world. So I'm really happy to have Misha Glenny doing the keynote, because he's moving away a little bit from the sort of conventional Russian media discussion that we've been having today, which has been fantastic, and taking us into the seamy and dark, and perhaps not so seamy and dark side of the Russian internet. Thank you very much for speaking here today. And I should add that Misha Glenny and his wife are visiting at SEPA this spring, sponsored by Harriman, my program, IMAC, and the Community of Global Thought. So we've just been very happy to have you here at Columbia this semester.
Thanks very much, Anya. This is billed as a keynote speech. It's actually going to be more of a keynote chat with plenty of informality thrown in, and I don't even mind being interrupted for questions and that sort of thing, because some of the things I'm going to talk about are likely to be unfamiliar to some of you. You never know. And really what I'm going to do is to look not so much at the media as we understand it as a form of public communication, but the medium of the internet and how it's developed in certain ways that are not always visible inside Russia and some of the other CIS countries, notably Ukraine. And this interest of mine emerged out of the research I did on my last book, Dark Market, which is really an attempt to map a quite important part of the global cyber underworld over the past 15 years or so. And anyone who engages with the cyber underworld, looking perhaps initially at conventional criminal activity on the internet, very quickly comes into contact with other actors involved in this world, not the least of which are the intelligence agencies of most major powers. And that's going to be one of the things I'm going to be concentrating on in the next few minutes as I speak. So my initial interest in this subject was sparked by the fact that it was a group of Ukrainian hackers and advanced computer users who in the year 2001 came up with the brilliant technique for overcoming what is the central challenge facing anyone involved in criminal activity on the internet. And that central challenge is, how can you do business with somebody on the internet if you're engaged in criminal activity when it's axiomatic that they're untrustworthy because they're criminals? So you have to find a way of establishing trust. And that's very difficult indeed. And then this rather brilliant group of Ukrainian hackers based in Odessa, where else, came up with this operation, which was a website called Carder Planet, www.carderplanet.com. And Carder Planet was a very brilliant thing. I don't know if any of you use forums on the internet for discussing your problems. We have a very well-known forum in the United Kingdom called Mumsnet, which is for people who have parenting problems. for example. So, you know, if you go onto the internet and you go to the section entitled Teenagers, and you put in a question saying, you know, I've just found a packet of condoms in my 13-year-old's daughter's drawer, what do I do? And lots of people will write back and say, this is how you solve that particular problem. And it's a way of engaging with a community that you need to get to very quickly. It's a very effective thing, the forum discussion. So, well, what Carter Planet was the first and one of the most successful forums for criminals. So if you were an internet criminal, you would sign on to www.carterplanet.com, and then you had various things that you could discuss. You could discuss stolen credit and debit card details. You could buy new viruses that have recently been developed. You could buy new identities, passports, driver's licenses, and so on from all over the world. And so you would go into that particular forum, and you'd see that someone had 5,000 stolen debit cards for sale. And this is where you have your problem. How do you know, because you're dealing with a criminal, that those 5,000 debit cards are actually debit cards which you can use to engage in criminal activity and steal money? And this is where the genius of Carter Planet and its founders, its administrators, who went rather unimaginatively under the name The Family. This is where their idea came in, which was very brilliant, and it was called the Escrow System. So one of the 5 administrators of the website said, right, okay, this is what we're going to do. We have appointed an escrow officer. So if you have your 5,000 debit or credit card, stolen debit or credit cards for sale, you then send it digitally to the escrow officer, and the person who wants to buy the credit and debit cards sends digitally the money. They usually, at this time, around 2,000. A functioning stolen debit card would cost between about $20 and $40. So you'd send 20 times $5,000 to the escrow officer. The escrow officer would then digitally send the details of a random sample of these debit cards to his friends in Toronto, in Rio, in Wellington, in Almaty, all over the place, and they would test them on ATM machines, and they would take the money out, and they would keep the money as a fee for the service, send some of it back to the escrow officer, and if they worked all over the world, the escrow officer would then release the debit cards to the purchaser and the money to the vendor. And this led to an extraordinary explosion in criminal activity all over the world based around debit and credit cards, and it's known as carding, hence Carter Planet. And this was a wild success, particularly in the first couple of years. Within about 6 months, there were 7,000 or 8,000 active members of Carter Planet. And I will talk about the media in Russia a little bit now. Probably one of the publications which has been amongst the most influential in Russia over the past 15 years, but which few people know about, is a magazine, an online magazine called hacker.ru. And there is not a single computer system in the world, which hasn't featured in one form or another in the monthly publication of hacker.ru, which you can go and read online. It is absolutely amazing. It is a Bible for those of you who want to hack and can speak Russian. Not only that, unlike most magazines about computers, they have long interviews with some of the most renowned and famous hackers and criminals in Russia. It's an incredibly useful resource for those of you who are investigating this sort of thing. So anyway, so Hacker.ru had some great articles, including a long interview with one of the founders of Carter Planet, a man named Script, whose real name is Dmitry Golubov, or Holubov, depending on whether you're Ukrainian-speaking or Russian-speaking. And Dmitry is now president of the Internet Party in Ukraine, with aspirations to become a leading political figure in Ukraine. Anyway, in an earlier version, Dimitri was the founder of Carder Planet. And it was such a success that in June 2001, the founders of Carder Planet resolved to hold in Odessa the first ever worldwide carding conference, International Worldwide Carding Conference. And this is true. From May the 30th to June the 2nd, cyber criminals from all over the world descended upon Odessa, and the plenary sessions were held in the Hotel Odessa. I don't know for those of you who've been to Odessa. The Hotel Odessa is the best place to stay because it's the only place in Odessa that you can't see the Hotel Odessa. And it's right at the bottom of the Potemkin steps, so you know there's a kind of, for those film aficionados amongst you, there's a sort of, frisson every time you look out of the window. And then the breakout sessions were held in restaurants and bars all over Odessa, and the breakout sessions were very interesting. They had sort of specialist areas of why do we concentrate so much on MasterCard and Visa? Shouldn't we develop our work on diners' cards and things like that as well? And so one of the things I was able to do, I was very, very proud of this, was to get hold of the press release for the first ever International Worldwide Carders Conference. And there in the press release, it was absolutely crystal clear about this, how this whole thing functioned. Because you would have thought that in somewhere like Russia and Ukraine, you would have thought that possibly these characters were not being observed by certain agencies. And if they were being observed by certain agencies, you would have thought that those agencies might have taken some active interest in their work. Well, you would have been right, but perhaps you wouldn't have been right as to the particular type of interest that those active agencies took in their work. So here we are, First World War. Okay, Resolution 1. Any carder found attacking the financial institutions of the Russian Federation, Belarus, Ukraine, and other member countries of the CIS shall be excluded from the Carder Planet community immediately. Full stop. So, very, very clear there. So, I fortunately, when I was doing the research for Dark Market, managed to track down one of the members of the family who was at the first Worldwide International Carders Conference, and who was actually responsible for Carder Planet's surveillance and security operation to try and see who those agencies were and what those agencies were doing when it came to the activities of the conference. And he explained to me very explicitly what the deal was when they were approached less by the SBU, more by the FSB, but the SBU at the time, this is in 2000, 2001, is essentially a sort of filial company of the FSB, and the FSB certainly has droit de seigneur over activities like these. And the SBU, the Ukrainian Security Service, of course, also had far fewer funds available for the development of its cyber resources than the FSB does, and we'll come on to what the FSB is able to do a little later on. Anyway, they were eventually approached quite directly, and they had negotiations as the carding community of the CIS with the FSB, and this is the deal that was struck. You are entitled to steal all the credit cards and debit cards you like from Western Europe, the United States, Japan, Middle East, South Africa, wherever, as long as you don't touch anything in the former Soviet Union. And as soon as you do touch anything in the former Soviet Union, you will be getting a virtual knock on the door at 4 o'clock in the morning. So that was the first part of the deal. So they are monitoring what is going on with the carding and the criminal community, and they're also monitoring the types of skills that are being developed in the criminal web world, and what lessons or, how instructive this might be for them at a later date. So that was one part of the deal. Now, Carder Planet, as I say, became hugely famous and hugely popular. It eventually closed down for a variety of reasons, a lot to do with internal problems. One or two of the characters were arrested, not actually in Ukraine or Russia, but elsewhere. The entire site had by this time been penetrated not just by the FSB and the SBU, but by the US Secret Service, by MI6 in the UK, and so on and so forth. Now, when they penetrate these sites, they often pose as members themselves, and they're attempting to do two things. They're attempting to build cases for possible criminal investigation and prosecution, but what they are also doing is they're attempting to identify what kind of weapons, tools, and techniques that these criminals on the internet are developing, because they're very useful weapons, tools, and techniques. So that's what was going on with Carter Planet. It collapsed, but Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus, but in particular Russia and Ukraine, developed a tremendous reputation for having the most efficient, effective underworld on the internet around the globe. The other great incubator of cyber criminal activity on the web was, perhaps surprisingly, Brazil. And Brazil is still a major exporter of cyber criminal activity. Increasingly so is China. But perhaps more of that a little bit later. Anyway, so the first deal is don't touch our institutions. Now, in the meanwhile, people like the FBI and the US Secret Service and the United States Postal Inspection Service are very interested in trying to establish cooperation with the MVD and the FSB to launch prosecutions over the rampant cybercrime emanating out of the former Soviet Union. But they largely reach a brick wall whenever they try and do this, because of course the FSB has the deal. Now, the other part of the deal that was made explicit to members or senior members of Carter Planet was that if the Russian Federation or Ukraine requires the hacking skills of criminals in the service of national security, then they will jump to it. So you began to see these clusters of hacking activity grow up in particular parts of the former Soviet Union, including some parts of the former Soviet Union which were by now members of the European Union. Latvia, most especially, and Estonia as well. Each of the clusters grew up for different reasons. Odessa's cluster grew up because it was an incredibly fluid criminal area, deeply corrupt, with systems of governance which were effectively non-functioning, but also there was a fairly significant amount of criminal control from Russian groups in Odessa, which was sanctioned and sponsored by the Russian state, because Odessa, of course, was the only warm water port for Russian oil exports. And so the influence of the Russian Federation and Russian criminal groups in Odessa was very, very significant. St. Petersburg grew up as a cluster area for hacking and cyber activity, partly under the influence of the liberalism of St. Petersburg in the early 1990s, and partly because as that morphed into the influence of Putinism, there were tremendous connections between people involved in hacking and in the FSB. If you look at the really advanced characters involved in computer technology in Russia, you will see, and I'll come to this a little bit later, a lot of people who were involved in state-sponsored operations in the 1970s, but particularly the 1980s, developing surveillance and other techniques for use on computers. And they went private in the 1990s when budgets for the FSB, or the KGB as it was at the time, collapsed by about 90% in 91, 92, 93, and have since developed very successfully businesses on a private basis, but they maintain their contacts with the FSB. But anyway, so you had St. Petersburg as a particularly powerful criminal and security cluster on the internet. Estonia was very interesting. Estonia provided a small group of very influential criminal hackers as a consequence of the fact that one of its towns on the northern coast, Silema was a closed facility in the Soviet Union, and it was the facility where the first nuclear device was developed in the Soviet Union. And of course, what happened when Estonia was taken over by the Soviets was when Silema was closed off, a lot of Russian scientists were sent to Silema where they were working on the nuclear program. And Silema became a very high-level facility during the Soviet Union. When things collapsed in 1990, partly because there were no state subsidies left for closed facilities, partly because it was no longer in Russia, and partly because of the resurgence of Estonian nationalism, this was a very, very depressed area. But it was a depressed area which had a lot of extremely smart and technically able Russians in it. And they started selling their skills to all sorts of people, but more to the point, their children developed the most fantastic computer skills. And out of a cluster of about 12 to 14 young hackers grew a system which then migrated to Petersburg called the Russian Business Network, or the RBN. And the RBN was a network of hosters. These are people who provide services if you want to use the internet. It was a so-called a bulletproof hosting system. That means that nobody from the outside can tell what you're doing inside those servers. And the RBN became the center for the largest single amount of spam email, illegal activity, of credit card fraud and that sort of thing, but also child pornography and so on and so forth. During the first decade of the millennium, until it was finally shut down in 2007, 2008. And the inspiration for the Russian Business Network, as I say, was this group of kids from Silema in Estonia. So you would see this really interesting clustering of activity going on all over the place. Now, the first time that the oh, sorry, I'm terribly sorry. I forgot to mention one thing. By now, one of the reasons why Carter Planet is so easily monitored by the FSB and the SBU is that the FSB have introduced legislation for the implementation of what is called SORM 2, which is the System of Operative Investigative Mechanisms for the entire internet over Russia. And SORM 2 compels ISPs, internet service providers, to provide all data that is going across the internet to storage servers provided by the FSB in Moscow and elsewhere. So the FSB has access to any activity that is going on the internet in Russia. ISPs in the early 2000s actually tried to go to court to try and bring SORM 2 down, partly because the ISPs under the legislation are required to pay for this, and it's quite an expensive and onerous business cost for them. on behalf of the Russian state, but they failed comprehensively, and centralized monitoring of the internet, of all internet activity, including all the live blogging stuff and all that sort of thing, is standard and par for the course. And I'll end up just by, when I finish in 5 minutes or so, telling you what sort of stuff they're doing now with that. Anyway, so it was 2007 that we had the first great test of Russia's hacking capability and its popular hacking capacity being deployed for national security purposes. And this was the much fabled attack on Estonia in April and May 2007 as a consequence of the really slightly laughable dispute about the movement of the statue to the Russian unknown soldier from the center of Tallinn into... actually, I mean, you know, one of the strange things about this is that it really was moved more or less just round the corner. I mean, it was literally a sort of mile or two away, and it actually, I went to see it in the place where it was moved to in the cemetery, and it actually looked extremely sort of rather moving and rather graceful. I thought it looked rather nice in its new place. Anyway, this resulted in the Russians denouncing the resurgence of Estonian fascism, followed by this extraordinary assault on Estonia's internet system. Now, Estonia, of course, is about the most wired country in Europe. And so that means that it's incredibly advanced in its use of the internet, but it's also very vulnerable if things go wrong. And this attack on its government websites, on its main media websites, huge attacks on its banking system and other administrative systems, was absolutely devastating. And within 3 or 4 days of this attack taking place, they realized that the only way they could save themselves from what was going on was to shut off the Estonian internet from the outside world. And that's what they did. And of course, if you shut off the internet from the outside world, you're kind of losing the point of the internet. So, that's what they did. They were astonished by the computing power that the Russians were able to generate, and they, along with the CIA, and indeed one of the guys who was running the security of the largest Estonian bank at the time, told me that as he was tracing back the attack of 80,000 zombie computers, these are computers which had come under the control of a single user who had successfully infected those 80,000 computers with a virus, he was able to trace it back as far as a server in Malaysia. And what did he discover in that server in Malaysia? He spotted internet activity in that server from both the United States and Israel. So the Estonians, who were the actual subject of the attack, were tracing the attack on their systems slower than the Americans and the Israelis, which says a lot in particular for the Israeli cyber capacity. And I'll mention a tiny little bit of thing about that later on, or towards the end in about 5 minutes or so. So anyway, so there we were. Huge attack, Estonia more or less brought to its knees. And of course the only way the Russians could do this was by mobilizing operations like the Russian business network on behalf of national state security. And very successful they were too, as they were next year when they launched a collateral cyber information attack on Georgia during the little war there in August 2008. So what you have with the internet in Russia is an extraordinary tool which is heavily weighted in favor of the state. I know that there is a hope and an optimism that the blogging community, that from Navalny onwards, we are seeing a community which is actually mobilizing opposition organizations in the state and is being able to use the internet for progressive political program, but I wouldn't hold your breath about this. We're also seeing at the same time what the FSB is currently introducing is the most advanced form of data and information analysis that is known to the world. This has now also been passed by the Collective Security Treaty Organization, which is basically Central Asia, Russia, Armenia, Ukraine, and so on. They are all introducing security analysis on the internet, which can monitor everything going on social media network sites. So as soon as they see anything like, let's meet down the Arbat at 5 o'clock, bring your baseball bats, or whatever it is you want to bring, they can identify where it's coming from, who's it going to, and what it probably means. And they can be there ready for it when it happens. They are developing and deploying around the internet in Russia speech recognition techniques which can identify people even when they are distorting their voice, either digitally or through the use of accents or change in pitch. And of course their photo recognition is also extremely advanced. The Russians are beginning to compete with West European and American companies in selling surveillance techniques all over the world, and they're doing a very good job of it. Now, here we have a real equivalence in terms of what is going on the internet as a whole. I think that you'll find that what we're actually seeing is, in the more global sense, a fragmentation of the internet into large national intranets, i.e. ones which function under a specific jurisdiction with very specific rules for that jurisdiction. I think you'll see that in the United States, I visited a couple of weeks ago the largest information technology annual jamboree in the US, which is called the RSA Conference, which takes place in San Francisco. And I went to the exhibit hall, and this was frankly the cyber military industrial complex at play. And they intend, I think, to start locking down the internet in the name of security wherever possible. At the moment we are seeing, this is excluding China and Russia, at the moment the Western world spends $100 billion a year on security technologies over the internet and over telecommunications. And our ability to use the internet is being restricted progressively by states around the world, both democratic states and non-democratic states, and they are all selling each other high-end surveillance and security technology. Much of this has been privatized, but much of it has come out of the state. This is the same model in Russia as it is in Israel and to an extent the United States. So, for example, those people who were working, as I said, in Russia on high-end computer stuff in the 1980s for the KGB, who left in the 1990s but who retained their friendships with personnel, have either gone back to the FSB now or they are being used as contract companies by the FSB to provide advanced surveillance technology. In Israel, they extremely intelligently invested in the late 70s and early 80s in a very specific unit of the IDF, 8200, which is there to develop internet offensive and defensive capability. Graduates of 8200 now run most of the mega corporations that provide internet security technologies to governments around the world. The United States trains up a lot of its officers in cyber, whether it's the CIA, whether it's the military, whether it's the DEA, or whether it's the FBI, who once they reach a certain level of competence are then poached by Google, by Microsoft, by McAfee, by Symantec. They're paid 10 times the amount that they can earn as a government employee, and of course they get to live on the West Coast and not in Washington, so they all go. And this is a pattern that is emerging pretty much around the world. Now, I say this, and I'll end up on this, is simply to add a note of caution for those people who believe that social media and social media networks are having a decisive political influence on political processes around the world. I think the thing that if you look at the events in Russia of last year, late last year, you could argue that the internet was a contributory factor, but you could also argue, I think, that that Putin's system was beginning to look tired and weak from a number of perspectives within and around the elite, as well as creating a fair amount of popular discontent. So I would caution people who believe that the internet is having that decisive impact, whether in Russia or whether in the Middle East and elsewhere. And I can guarantee you that all states currently feeling in the least threatened by the internet are undertaking very advanced programs in order to ensure that their power bases will not be threatened by a political movement spreading out across the web. So there you have it. That was my keynote chat. Thank you very much. And I'm going to see Dunia at 6 o'clock, but I'm happy to answer questions before then if there are any.
Yes, hi, I'm Jim Dingman. I wanted you to talk a little bit about the 419 phenomenon in Nigeria and how you can relate to this. And I could give a personal example. Just a few months ago, Comrex, which allows you to do remotes, was in a location not too far south of here, and the communications of it were by Twitter. And when people came to the apartment where the Comrex was to be used for a demonstration, guess who was there? NYPD. So this is being done in the United States right now as we speak. But the 419 thing, how do they interrelate to this whole 50
Well, the 419 is actually, for those who don't know what a 419 is, a 419 scam, for those of you who've received emails announcing that somebody has left you $15 million. Often Sani Abacha, the late Sani Abacha, the late great president of Nigeria. And all you have to do is get in touch with these people to organize the transfer of your money. And then when you get in touch, they say, absolutely fine, the money's all yours, but please send us $4,000 first of all, and then we shall transfer the money after these legal fees have been paid. And then, of course, you never hear from them again. Now, this is called the 419 scam after the particular clause in the Nigerian Penal Code, or the advanced fee fraud. And I first came across I first came across the 419 fraud when I was watching a production of The Alchemist by Ben Jonson, the great Elizabethan writer at the National Theatre. And halfway through, I had to restrain myself from standing up and saying, it's a 419 scam. But The Alchemist is an advanced fee fraud. So this is a scam that's been going on for years and years and years, 5 centuries at least. But what the internet has done has enabled it to go global, which is absolutely fabulous. And the Nigerians are particularly engaged in elaborating in the most theatrical manner possible the 419 schemes. And I'm very, very fond of some of these ideas they come up with. But it's really, the 419 scam is based upon the assumption, to put it in colloquial terms, that there is a sucker born every minute. Because if you want, out of the blue, to send $5,000 to a bank account in Benin, then by all means go ahead and do it. You've clearly got too much money in the first place. So, so it's a particular type of scam. The interesting thing is if you talk to the UNDP or if you talk to the World Bank and you say to them, what do you think about the fact that there's going to be a fiber optic internet cable running from Kenya down to Tanzania, they will say, this is fabulous. You know, Africa's joining the digital age and it's going to be absolutely terrific. If you pose the same question to an FBI officer, they will put their head in their hands and say, oh my God, the tsunami is coming. So that's what I'd say. That's what's happening next with 419.
Since this is a chat, I'm going to weigh in and say that there's a fantastic novel about these scams, which is called I Do Not Come to You by Chance. And it's written by young Nigerian women. And the characters are a whole house of people in Lagos. And everyone in the house is allowed to scam whoever they want. So the gardener is cheating people in the United States. The cleaning lady is cheating people in London. And it's all run by this sort of big, rich uncle whose kind of penniless nephew comes to him and gets into the business in order to pay for the scholarship. So I don't know if you've read that book.
I can't wait.
I do not come to you. So that's my weighing in on that topic.
I never thought a talk on computers could possibly be interesting to me. A block of marble and a chisel is a perfectly respectable way of communicating. And I'd like to mention Ben Jonson because there's an historical aspect to this. It seems that every major innovation in communications has initially been greeted with apprehension and rather sometimes justified. When the printing press was invented, the humanists were outraged. They were convinced they would flood the market with garbage, literary garbage. And in fact, in the young Soviet Union, that virtually happened when Gorky started the Project Kult and solicited manuscripts from workers and peasants. That's just about the result. And when the telephone was invented, people thought, there goes our privacy. They'll phone us at midnight, they'll phone us at dinner time. So it's simply a question of ironing out of the wrinkles. And the question is, who's ahead? Are the ones who are protecting us, are they one jump ahead of the criminals? Or is it not
no, that equation is quite simple. That equation is the other way around. The criminals the problem is, there are two issues that you raised. First of all, when I decided to write a book about this dark market, I was confronted with this very problem. Most people in the world think that, and with good reason, computers are witlessly boring. And so if you're going to write a book about computers, you have to get around that fact. And so instead of writing about computers, what I did is I went and watched a whole load of Hollywood movies which purport to have computers at the center, and I had mercifully just read the magisterial trilogy of Stieg Larsson, the Millennium trilogy, starting with The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, and I noticed when people talked to me about it, they always said, oh, isn't it amazing what that girl can do with computers? And if you look at the book, it's about sort of 0.5% of the book is about computers. The rest of it is just a good old political, corrupt criminal yarn. Very well done for our age, I think. And Elizabeth Salander certainly is a very, very credible figure, except for the fact that she's a woman, because 95% of hackers are men. But there's no doubt, if she was one of the 5%, there are people with these extraordinary skills. Hacking skills, photographic memories, advanced maths and science ability. I've met them, I've interviewed them at length, and she's wonderful. But what I realized from that, and what I realized from watching the Hollywood movies, which were 99% bog standard Hollywood movies, and then every so often someone would sort of furiously tap at a computer and say, oh my God, it's the Diatron, ah! And that's it. I realized that don't write about computers if you want to write about computers. Write about the people behind the computers. So that's why I tracked down the hackers, the cops, and what a strange, weird, wonderful bunch of people they all were, from all over the world, from all different social backgrounds. As I say, the only factor that is usually the same is the fact that they're men, but otherwise they're incredibly different in all sorts of ways. So that's how you try and start to make computers interesting, because they are, I agree with you, intrinsically boring in so many ways. In the question of the technology thing, the difference is that networked computers and the internet, it's very genius lies in its interconnectedness. But that is also where its Achilles heel lies. That this is a technology that is incredibly sensitive, upon which we have become unbelievably dependent. You really don't know just how dependent we are on network systems now, and how easily, if a network system goes down, then the supply of foodstuffs to shops can dry up very quickly, the supply of water, and so on and so forth. We are hugely dependent on these systems. We have forgotten how to do certain everyday things. When was the last time anyone remembered a telephone number, for example? Now, you lose your mobile phone, and you can't remember anyone's numbers to ring up anymore because we've stored them all on our phone, and we don't memorize them anymore. So all sorts of things are changing the way that we deal with things. And this technology is incredibly powerful, and you are linking up to the same system which is across which advanced weaponry moves as well. You're also a vulnerability. We now have advanced cyber weaponry being developed by over 100 states around the world. They use the techniques of criminals. They use you as a vulnerability because we don't know about cybersecurity at all. Anonymous, the great political activist group of the internet, is a very interesting phenomenon, but one with a real, again, with an Achilles heel. If you're attacked by Anonymous, do you know that you're being attacked by Anonymous, or are you being attacked by, I don't know, French intelligence, or are you being attacked by a criminal group? And so what I'm saying is that this technology, as opposed to technology in the past, is both immensely powerful, but it's also accessed by everyone on a daily basis in much of their lives. And that means that in terms of the problems that it causes, obviously the convenience and the fantastic things that it does goes without saying, but the problems it causes are actually of a different nature than the problems caused by telephones or by the book. So I mean, what I say to people is that unfortunately, boring though it may be, this is an issue that we have to start engaging with. In particular, because I see states with abandon now developing surveillance and control techniques, which it is very easy for them to deploy without proper oversight from the criminal justice system. And so be warned is all I say, but enjoy the internet in the meanwhile.
Good. Misha, that was a fantastic ending. We're out of time, but this is going to another event, which we're all ready to on the 12th floor. So thank you so much for a really wonderful.
Welcome.